the music stopped. Not slowly. All at once, like someone had cut a wire. Marco De Luca stood in the middle of his own engagement party, a glass of wine still warm in his hand, and watched the doors of the ballroom open. For a moment he thought his mind was playing a trick on him. Then he saw her face, and he knew it wasn't. Valentina. 20 years. 20 years of silence, and now she was standing there in a soft blue dress, her hand resting lightly on the arm of a man Marco did not know. Every guest in the room turned to look. Somewhere behind him, he heard his fiancée, Renata, whisper his name, but he couldn't answer her. He couldn't move at all. This is where our story truly begins. If you love emotional stories about love, loss, family secrets, and second chances, this one is for you. Please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who still believes in the power of the truth. Now, let's go back to where it all started. 3 hours earlier, the De Luca estate had been full of light and laughter. White flowers lined every table. Waiters moved quietly between guests with trays of champagne. Marco stood near the fountain in the garden, greeting old friends, shaking hands, smiling in a way that felt, for the first time in years, easy. At 54, Marco was still a powerful man. Men lowered their voices when he entered a room. But tonight, he wasn't thinking about business or power. He was thinking about Renata, who stood a few feet away, laughing softly at something his daughter Julia had said. Renata Colombo was calm where Marco was intense, warm where he was guarded. She had entered his life 2 years ago, quietly and without demands, and slowly she had convinced him that maybe, after everything, he still deserved to be happy. "You look nervous," Renata said, coming to stand beside him. She placed her hand on his arm. "I'm not nervous," Marco said. "I'm just thinking." "About what?" He looked at the garden, at the guests, at his daughter across the lawn. "About how long it took me to get here." Julia De Luca watched her father from a distance, a glass of sparkling water untouched in her hand. She was happy for him. She truly was. But there was a heaviness in her chest that she couldn't explain, not fully, not even to herself. She had grown up hearing the same explanation for her parents' divorce. They grew apart. It happens. But Julia had never believed it. She remembered small things from her childhood, the way her mother used to stare out of windows, the way her father worked later and later each night, the silence that filled their house long before the papers were signed. Grown apart did not explain that kind of silence. Tonight, she had made a decision. A decision she hadn't told anyone about, not even her mother. She had invited Valentina. Julia told herself it was simple. Her mother deserved to see the man Marco had become. Her father deserved to see that Valentina had also found peace. Maybe, she told herself, it would give everyone a sense of closure before her father remarried. But somewhere deeper, in a place she didn't like to look at too closely, Julia wanted something else. She wanted to see her parents in the same room, one last time, and watch what happened. Inside the house, the string quartet began to play. Guests were asked to move indoors for the toasts. Marco took Renata's hand and led her toward the ballroom, his heart full in a way it hadn't been in years. He had no idea what was waiting for him at the door. As the doors opened for the final guests to enter, Marco was mid-sentence, laughing at something his old friend Alberto. No, wait, he did not know Alberto yet, was mid-sentence with one of his men, when the room grew quiet. He turned. And there she was. Valentina Romano stood at the entrance in a soft blue dress, her hair pulled back the way it used to be many years ago. Beside her stood a tall, silver-haired man with a gentle, respectable face, a man Marco had never seen before, his hand resting protectively but kindly at her back. Marco's glass nearly slipped from his fingers. For 20 years, he had built a life around not thinking about her. He had trained himself not to remember the sound of her laugh, or the way she used to touch his face when he came home tired. He thought he had buried all of it. He was wrong. Across the room, Valentina's eyes found his. For one long second, neither of them looked away. 20 years fell between them, and neither of them could speak. Julia stood near the back of the room, her heart pounding, watching the moment she had set in motion unfold exactly as she had feared, and hoped, it would. Marco De Luca had come tonight to promise his future to another woman. He had not expected his past to walk through the door. 30 years earlier, Marco De Luca was a different man. He was young then, 24, hungry to prove himself in a world that did not forgive weakness. His father, Antonio De Luca, had built a name that carried both respect and fear through the city, and Marco had grown up understanding that one day, that name would be his to carry too. He met Valentina at a wedding that was not even his own. She was standing near the edge of the dance floor, laughing at something her cousin had said, and Marco found himself unable to look away from her. She wasn't like the women his father introduced him to, women chosen for their family names or their usefulness. Valentina worked in a small bookshop near the harbor. She had ink-stained fingers and a laugh that came easily and honestly. "You're staring," she told him, when he finally found the courage to approach her. "I know," Marco said. "I'm trying to stop." "Is it working?" "No." She laughed, and something in Marco's chest loosened, like a knot he hadn't known was there. They were married a year later, in a small ceremony that Antonio disapproved of from the very beginning. He never said it outright, not at first. He simply watched Valentina with cold, careful eyes, the way a man studies something he does not trust. "She is not one of us," Antonio told Marco once, quietly, after the wedding. "She will make you soft." Marco had laughed it off then. He believed love could survive anything, even his father's disapproval. For a while, it seemed he was right. The early years of their marriage were full of warmth. Valentina filled their home with books and music and laughter that echoed through rooms that had once felt cold and formal. Marco found himself rushing home earlier, just to see her face when he walked through the door. 2 years into their marriage, Valentina gave birth to a son. They named him Nico. Marco had never known love like it. He remembered the first night he held his son, how small and warm he felt in his arms, how Nico's tiny fingers wrapped around his own. For the first time in his life, Marco understood what his father had never taught him, that strength and tenderness could exist in the same heart. "He has your eyes," Valentina whispered that night, watching Marco hold their son. "God help him," Marco said softly, and she laughed, resting her head on his shoulder. Those were the golden years. Marco worked hard, but he made time for Sunday mornings at the harbor, time for Nico's small hands wrapped around his fingers as they walked along the water, time for quiet evenings when Valentina would read aloud from whatever book she was working through that week, her voice filling their home like music. Antonio, however, never fully accepted her. He watched his son grow gentler, watched him leave business meetings early to be home for his family, and something in him grew uneasy. He began to see Valentina not as the woman who made his son happy, but as the woman who was pulling his son away from the life Antonio had built for him. "A man in our world cannot afford to be soft," Antonio told Marco one evening, after Marco had left an important meeting early to attend Nico's school event. "Family is family, Marco. But business does not wait for bedtime stories." Marco brushed off his father's words as he always did. He believed, foolishly perhaps, that he could have both, the empire his father had built, and the family he had built with Valentina. He believed love and duty could share the same house. He did not yet know how deeply his father disagreed. By the time Nico turned 5, Marco had begun to believe that he had built something his father never had, a life with both power and peace. He did not know that his father was already watching, waiting, convinced that sooner or later, he would need to intervene to save his son from what he saw as a dangerous weakness. He did not know that the happiest years of his life were about to end, and that the reason would not be the world he had been born into. It would be a tragedy no one could have prepared for. Nico was 6 years old when he got sick. It began quietly, the way tragedies often do, a fever that would not break, a tiredness that worried the doctors more than they let on. Marco and Valentina spent weeks at his bedside, holding his small hands, telling him stories, promising him that everything would be fine. It was not fine. Nico died on a cold morning in early spring, with Valentina's hand in his and Marco standing frozen by the window, unable to move, unable to believe that the small boy who had once wrapped his fingers around Marco's own was gone. There is no describing the silence that follows the loss of a child. It is not peace. It is a silence that presses on the chest and refuses to lift. Marco and Valentina grieved, but they grieved in different directions, like two rivers that had once flowed together suddenly pulling apart. Valentina needed to talk. She needed to sit with Marco in the quiet and remember Nico out loud, to say his name, to cry without being told it was time to be strong. She needed Marco beside her, not just in the house, but truly present. Marco did not know how to give her that. He had been raised to believe that pain was something to be carried alone, buried beneath duty and work. So he did what his father had taught him to do. He worked. He threw himself into the family business with a ferocity he had never shown before, staying out late, taking on responsibilities he didn't need to take, filling every hour so there would be no space left for the grief waiting for him at home. He told himself he was protecting Valentina from having to watch him fall apart. He told himself this was strength. It was not strength. It was distance, and it grew wider every day. "You're never home," Valentina told him one night, her voice hollow with exhaustion. I lost my son, Marco. I feel like I'm losing my husband too. I'm working, Marco said. For us. For our future. I don't want a future without you in it, she whispered. I want you here. Now. With me. Marco did not know how to explain that being home, in the silence, surrounded by Nico's empty room, felt unbearable. He did not know how to tell her that his heart was breaking too, in a way he had no words for. So he said nothing, and the silence between them grew heavier with each passing week. Antonio watched all of this from the shadows of the family estate, and he saw something he believed he needed to fix. He believed Valentina's grief was pulling his son away from his responsibilities, away from the strength a man in their world needed to survive. He did not see two parents drowning in the same loss. He saw a threat to everything he had built. He began to speak to Marco privately, planting small seeds of doubt. She blames you, Antonio told him once. I've seen the way she looks at you. Grief changes people, Marco. Sometimes it changes what they feel for the ones around them. Marco did not want to believe it, but exhaustion and grief make people vulnerable to doubt. Slowly, painfully, he began to wonder if his father was right, if Valentina's silence toward him was blame instead of grief, if her tears were about losing Nico or about resenting the man beside her. Valentina, for her part, began to wonder something just as painful. She began to believe that Marco's absence meant he no longer needed her, that perhaps he had already begun to move past both her and their son, retreating into a world she had never fully belonged to. Neither of them knew that the other was writing letters that were never delivered, reaching out in ways the other would never see. Neither of them knew that Antonio had already made his decision. 2 years after Nico's death, Marco and Valentina signed divorce papers in near silence. There were no dramatic arguments, no shouted accusations. Only two exhausted people, worn down by grief and misunderstanding, who no longer believed the other one cared enough to fight for what they built. Valentina left the De Luca estate that same week, taking little Julia, who was only 3 years old, and moved into a small apartment near the harbor, close to the bookshop where she and Marco had once fallen in love. Marco buried himself even deeper into the family business, becoming the man his father had always wanted him to be, powerful, respected, and utterly alone. Neither of them knew the truth. And for 20 years, neither of them would. Back in the present, the ballroom remained frozen in that strange, suspended silence. Renata was the first to move. She stepped forward slightly, her hand finding Marco's arm again, grounding him. Marco, she said softly. Do you know her? Marco blinked, as if waking from a dream he hadn't realized he was having. Yes, he said quietly. That's Valentina. Julia's mother. Understanding passed over Renata's face, followed quickly by something gentler, not jealousy, but concern. She had heard about Valentina before, in the careful, distant way people speak of a painful chapter long closed. She had never expected to meet her like this. Across the room, Valentina was equally frozen. The man beside her, Alberto Ferraro, leaned down slightly. Are you all right? He asked quietly. I didn't know he'd be. Valentina stopped herself. Of course Marco would be here. It was his engagement party. I'm fine, she said, though her voice betrayed her. Alberto had been a steady presence in Valentina's life for the past 3 years, ever since they'd met at a charity dinner neither of them had wanted to attend. He was a widower, kind and unhurried, a man who had learned patience through his own losses. He did not know the full story of Valentina's marriage, only that it had ended in pain long ago, and that she rarely spoke of it. He squeezed her hand gently now, a quiet reminder that he was there. Julia crossed the room quickly, forcing a bright smile onto her face that did not fully reach her eyes. Mom, she said, embracing Valentina. I'm so glad you came. Julia, Valentina said, her voice tight, you didn't tell me this was. I know, Julia said quickly, quietly. I should have. I'm sorry. I wanted you here. Marco approached slowly, as though crossing the room required more courage than anything he'd done in years. Up close, Valentina looked both the same and entirely different, the same soft eyes, the same way she tilted her head when she was uncertain, but with 20 years of a life he knew nothing about written into the lines of her face. Valentina, he said. Marco. Her voice was careful, controlled. Congratulations. Julia told me about your engagement. Thank you, he said, and then, because he didn't know what else to say, you look well. So do you. The politeness between them was almost unbearable, a thin layer stretched over something much deeper that neither of them dared to touch. Alberto extended his hand toward Marco. "Alberto Ferraro," he said. "It's good to finally meet you." Marco shook his hand, studying him for a moment. There was no threat in Alberto, no rivalry, only a quiet decency that made it somehow harder for Marco to know how to feel. He had almost hoped, in some small, embarrassing corner of his heart, to find something to dislike about the man standing beside his ex-wife. He found nothing. The party resumed around them, slowly, guests returning to their conversations, though the air in the room had shifted permanently. Marco and Renata continued greeting guests, but Marco found his eyes drifting again and again toward the corner where Valentina stood with Julia, talking quietly. Later that evening, during a lull in the celebration, Marco found himself alone with Valentina near the garden doors, both of them stepping outside for air at the same moment. "I didn't know she'd invited you," Marco said. "I almost didn't come," Valentina admitted. "I told myself it would be good for Julia, to see us both here without any tension. I'm not sure I believed it, even as I said it." Marco looked at her carefully. "Are we without tension?" Valentina almost smiled. "No," she said honestly. "I don't think we ever really finished, Marco. I think we just stopped." The words landed somewhere deep in Marco's chest, somewhere he had kept locked for 20 years. "I used to wonder," he said quietly, "if you ever thought about it. About us. About what happened." "Every day," Valentina said, before she could stop herself. Then, embarrassed, she looked away. For a long time, at least. Neither of them said anything else. The silence between them was different now, not the empty silence of their final years together, but something heavier, full of questions neither of them had the courage to ask. Inside, Julia watched them through the garden doors, her heart aching with a mixture of hope and guilt. She had wanted this moment, had orchestrated it carefully, and now, watching her parents standing together in the moonlight, she felt the full weight of what she still didn't know. There had to be a reason. There had to be something more than "we grew apart." That night, after the party ended and the guests had gone home, Julia made a decision. She would go to her grandfather's old estate, the one that had sat mostly untouched since Antonio's death 5 years earlier, and she would search until she found the truth. She had no idea what she was about to uncover. The De Luca family estate had belonged to Antonio for over 50 years, and even now, 5 years after his death, it still carried the weight of his presence. Dark wood, heavy curtains, portraits of ancestors who had built the family's power with hands that had never known softness. Julia had not spent much time here as a child. Her grandfather had been a distant, formal man, more interested in what she might one day become useful for than in who she actually was. But she remembered the study, a room at the back of the house where Antonio had kept his private papers, a room no one had properly gone through since he died. She arrived on a quiet afternoon, letting herself in with the old key her father had given her years ago, and made her way to the study. Dust covered everything. Boxes of old documents, business records, and personal effects sat stacked against the walls, untouched. It took her nearly 3 hours of searching before she found it, a small wooden box, pushed to the back of the bottom drawer of Antonio's desk, locked with a simple latch that had rusted with age. Inside, wrapped in a faded ribbon, were dozens of letters. Julia's hands trembled slightly as she lifted them out. The handwriting on the front of each envelope was unmistakable. She had seen it on birthday cards, on notes left on the kitchen counter throughout her childhood. It was her father's handwriting. Every envelope was addressed to Valentina Romano. None of them had ever been opened. None of them had ever been sent. Julia sat down slowly in her grandfather's old chair, her heart pounding, and opened the first letter with careful, shaking hands. "My dearest Valentina. I don't know if you will ever read this, but I have to try. I know things have been hard between us since we lost Nico. I know I have not been the husband you needed these past months. I have been a coward, hiding in work because I do not know how to sit with this pain the way you do, so bravely, every day. Please do not give up on us. I am asking you to meet me, just the two of us, away from this house, away from everything my father has built. I want to start over somewhere far from here, somewhere our son's memory can live in peace instead of silence. I love you. I have never stopped, even when I don't know how to show it. Please write back. Please give me a chance to be the husband you deserve. Yours always, Marco." Julia pressed a hand to her mouth, tears filling her eyes as she reached for the next letter, and the next, and the next. Each one told the same story in different words, a man reaching desperately for the woman he loved, begging her not to let their grief become the end of them, pleading for a chance to rebuild what tragedy had broken. There were letters asking Valentina to see a counselor with him. Letters proposing they move away entirely, start fresh in a city with no connection to the De Luca name. Letters written late at night, the ink smudged in places that looked like they might have been touched by tears. Valentina had never seen a single one of them. Julia understood immediately what had happened, even before she found the final piece of evidence, a short, cold note in her grandfather's handwriting, tucked at the very bottom of the box, clearly never meant to be found. The woman is weakening him. If he leaves, he takes everything with him, the name, the business, the family's future. I will not allow 20 years of work to end because of one woman's grief. He will thank me one day, when he understands what truly matters. Antonio De Luca had intercepted every single letter his son had written. He had made sure Valentina received nothing, no explanation, no reaching hand, nothing but silence that she had mistaken for indifference. And Julia suspected, though she would need more time to confirm it, that her grandfather had done the same in reverse, ensuring that whatever Valentina had tried to say to Marco during those broken months never reached him either. 20 years of grief, resentment, and quiet heartbreak, and it had all been built on a lie orchestrated by a man who believed love was a weakness he could not allow his son to keep. Julia sat in the dusty study for a long time, the letters spread across her lap, tears falling freely now. She thought of her mother, alone for 20 years, believing Marco had stopped loving her. She thought of her father, burying himself in work and power, believing Valentina had given up on their marriage. She thought of her own wedding, still months away, and the toast she had already begun writing in her mind, one that was about to change completely. There was only one thing left to do. Her parents needed to know the truth, and she would not let another day pass in silence, not after seeing what silence had already cost them. She began to plan exactly how, and when, she would show them. Julia decided not to wait. 2 weeks after the engagement party, she arranged a small family dinner at her own home, telling her father and mother separately that she wanted them both there, along with Renata and Alberto, to talk about the wedding plans. It was a lie, but a necessary one. When everyone had gathered around the table, and the initial nervous small talk had settled, Julia stood, her hands trembling slightly around the small wooden box she had carried in from the car. "I need to show you all something," she said. "And I need you to know that I found this by accident, while going through grandfather's old study." She placed the box on the table and opened it, revealing the stack of unopened letters inside. Valentina's face went pale the moment she recognized the handwriting on the envelopes. "Marco," she whispered, "those are—" "I know," Julia said gently. "I read them. All of them." Marco stared at the box, confusion and dawning horror moving across his face. "Those letters," he said slowly, "I wrote those. I wrote them after Nico died. I sent them to you, Valentina. I waited every day for you to write back." "I never received them," Valentina said, her voice breaking. "Marco, I never got a single one. I thought," she stopped, pressing a hand to her mouth. "I thought you'd stop caring. I thought you'd already moved on, and I was too ashamed to keep reaching out to a man who didn't want me anymore." "I never stopped," Marco said, his own voice raw now, stripped of the calm control he usually carried. "I asked you to meet me. I asked you to leave with me, to start over somewhere far from all of this. I thought you ignored every letter because you'd decided I wasn't worth fighting for." Julia reached into the box and pulled out the final note, the one written in her grandfather's hand, and placed it gently on the table between them. Marco read it in silence, his jaw tightening with each word. When he finished, he set it down carefully, as though touching it too roughly might make the truth inside it even more unbearable. "My father," he said quietly. "My father did this. He intercepted every letter," Julia said. "I believe he may have done the same with anything Mom tried to send you. I found this note with them. He was afraid that if you left with Mom, he'd lose you, lose the business, the family name, everything he'd built. He decided our family's grief was something he could control." The room was silent except for Valentina's quiet, disbelieving tears. Alberto sat beside her, his hand resting gently on her back, saying nothing, simply present, the way he had always been. 20 years, Valentina finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. 20 years, Marco, believing you didn't want me. Believing I wasn't enough to make you stay. I believed the same about you, Marco said. I convinced myself you'd already given up, that fighting for us would only make things worse. My father made sure of that too, feeding me doubts every chance he had. Renata sat quietly through all of this, watching the two of them, watching 20 years of grief and misunderstanding unravel in front of her. She felt something settle in her chest, quiet and certain, though she said nothing yet. I'm sorry, Marco said, turning to Valentina, though the apology felt impossibly small against the weight of what had been stolen from them. I'm so sorry. If I had known. I know, Valentina said softly. I know you would have come. They sat with that truth for a long moment, both of them changed by it in ways neither could fully put into words yet. Later that night, after Valentina and Alberto had left, and Julia had retreated to give her father space, Renata found Marco alone on the terrace, staring out at nothing in particular. I've been watching you all evening, Renata said quietly, coming to stand beside him. Even before tonight. Since the party. Marco didn't answer immediately. Renata, You don't have to explain, she said gently. I care about you, Marco. I do. But I saw your face tonight, and I saw it at the party too. There's a part of your heart that never finished with her. It's not your fault. You didn't even know the truth until now. Renata. I don't want to compete with 20 stolen years, Renata said, her voice steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes. That isn't fair to you, and it isn't fair to me. I think you need to make peace with what you lost before you can build something new with anyone, including me. Marco looked at her, grief and gratitude tangled together in his chest. You deserve better than this, he said quietly. I deserve someone whose whole heart is free to love me, Renata said, gently removing the engagement ring and placing it in his palm, closing his fingers around it with a tenderness that made the moment ache all the more. I hope you find peace, Marco. I truly do. She left him standing alone on the terrace, the ring cold in his hand, the truth of 20 lost years settling over him like a weight he did not yet know how to carry. In the weeks that followed, Marco did not reach out to Valentina, and Valentina did not reach out to him. It wasn't coldness that kept them apart. It was the sheer weight of what they now understood, too heavy to rush toward one another as though 20 years could simply be undone. Marco spent those weeks in a kind of quiet reckoning. He visited his father's grave for the first time in years, standing over the cold stone for a long time, saying nothing at first, then finally speaking the anger he had carried silently since the night at Julia's table. You took everything, he said quietly to the grave. You took her from me. You took our chance to grieve our son together. You told yourself you were protecting me, but you destroyed the only thing that ever made me whole. There was no answer, of course. There never would be. But saying it out loud, standing in the cold morning air, Marco felt something inside him loosen, just slightly, for the first time in 20 years. He stepped back from the idea of marriage entirely, not because he no longer believed in love, but because he understood now that he needed to grieve properly, for Nico, for the marriage he had lost, for the 20 years stolen from him by a man who believed control was the same as love. He began seeing a therapist, something his father would have called weakness, something Marco now understood as the opposite. Valentina, for her part, leaned on Alberto through the difficult weeks that followed. He never once made her feel guilty for the grief that had resurfaced, never asked her to move past it faster than she was ready to. He simply stayed, steady and patient, the way he always had been. You don't have to decide anything right now, he told her one evening, as they sat together on her small balcony overlooking the harbor. You just found out the truth about 20 years of your life. Give yourself time. I care about you, Alberto, Valentina said honestly. That hasn't changed. I know, he said, and he meant it. And whatever you decide, about Marco, about the past, about any of it, I'll still be here. That's not conditional. Valentina began confronting her grief in ways she never had before, finally speaking openly about Nico, about the marriage she had lost, about the years of silence she had carried like a stone in her chest. It didn't erase the pain, but it lightened it, slowly, the way honest grief always does. A year passed. Julia's wedding arrived on a warm afternoon in early autumn, the garden of the De Luca estate transformed with white flowers and soft golden light, not unlike the engagement party that had changed everything 12 months earlier. This time, there was no shock at the door, no frozen silence. Marco and Valentina had spent the past year slowly rebuilding something honest between them, not a romance, not yet, but a friendship built on truth instead of assumption. They sat together at the reception, at Julia's insistence, at a table near the dance floor. Alberto sat beside Valentina, and though Marco had come alone, there was no bitterness in the air between any of them, only the quiet ease of people who had made peace with a complicated truth. As the evening wore on, the band began to play something slow, and Julia and her new husband took the floor for their first dance as a married couple. Marco watched his daughter with a fullness in his chest he hadn't expected, pride and love and grief all tangled together. When the song shifted into something softer, Marco turned to Valentina. Would you dance with me? He asked. For old times. Valentina glanced at Alberto, who nodded gently, a small, understanding smile on his face. Go, he said. It's all right. She took Marco's hand, and they moved onto the floor together, slowly, carefully, the way two people do when they are relearning how to be close to one another after a lifetime apart. If I had known, Marco said quietly, as they moved together, about the letters. About any of it. My whole life would have been different. Mine too, Valentina said softly. I used to imagine, sometimes, what it would have been like if I'd just written back, even once. If I'd pushed harder instead of assuming the silence meant you didn't care. We were both grieving, Marco said. We were both doing the best we could with what we thought was true. I know, Valentina said. I don't blame either of us anymore. Not really. Just him. They didn't say anything else for a while, simply moving together to the music, two people carrying 20 years of loss and understanding in the space between them. When the song ended, they didn't kiss. They didn't make promises about the future. There was no dramatic declaration, no sudden decision to start over. Instead, they simply stood together for a moment, hands still lightly joined, sharing something quieter and perhaps more honest than any grand romantic gesture could have offered. A moment of peace that had taken 20 years and one small wooden box of letters to finally arrive. Later that evening, Marco and Valentina stood side by side near the edge of the garden, watching Julia laugh with her new husband beneath the string lights, surrounded by family and friends. She looks happy, Valentina said. She does, Marco agreed. She got that from you, I think. That ability to find light, even after everything. Valentina smiled, a real, easy smile that reached her eyes for the first time in a long while. Maybe we both did something right, somewhere along the way. Whether Marco and Valentina would ever find their way fully back to one another, no one could say for certain, not even them. But standing there together, finally free of the lie that had stolen 20 years from them, they were no longer haunted by unanswered questions. They had learned, finally, painfully, and completely, that their love had never truly died. It had simply been buried beneath a silence neither of them had chosen, a silence built not from a lack of love, but from a lie that had stolen the future they were always meant to have. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to subscribe, like this video, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts on Marco and Valentina's story. Do you think they'll find their way back to each other? Let us know below, and share this video with someone who believes that the truth always finds its way to the surface, no matter how long it takes.